The day the letter arrived, the sky was the same shade of pale gray my grandfather always called storm weather. I was sorting through the week's mail on the porch of the ranch house, sipping coffee gone lukewarm in the cup. There were bills, a farm supply catalog, and then a thick white envelope with my name typed in bold capital letters. The return address read, Hillside Meadows Homeowners Association, a name I barely recognized. Tore it open, expecting some harmless notice, never imagining it would ignite a war. Inside was a crisp letter on heavy stock paper, embossed with the HOA's logo in gold foil. It didn't start with Dear Mr. Carter or any polite preamble. It began with an invoice. In sharp black ink, the number stood out like a scar. $250,000. My eyes darted over words like past dues, fines, and accrued interest in a dizzying spiral of legal jargon. By the time I reached the signature, my stomach felt like it had swallowed a brick. I set the letter down and looked out over the acres of rolling pasture beyond the porch rail. The land had been mine for barely 3 months, passed down after my father's sudden death in the spring. I'd spent those months tending fences, repairing the barn roof, and learning how to live without his steady voice. Now some group of strangers claimed I owed them more money than I'd ever seen in one place. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh almost. But there was nothing funny about the second page. It was a list of violations dating back 15 years, long before I'd even lived here. They accused my father of ignoring landscaping rules, refusing HOA inspections, and unpaid annual dues. Each supposed infraction carried a fine, and every fine had gathered interest like dry leaves in a corner. By their math, the debt had grown into a small fortune, and now it was my burden. The ranch had been in my family for over a century, older than the town that had swallowed it over decades. Remembered when our land stretched all the way to the ridge, before the houses crept up like weeds. Hillside Meadows was one of those planned communities, neat lawns, matching mailboxes, and rules for everything. I had always assumed the ranch stood apart from them, an island of old history amid new concrete. Apparently I was wrong. That night I spread the letter and every scrap of paper from the envelope across the kitchen table. My boots tracked dust on the linoleum, but I didn't care. I studied the pages until the numbers blurred and my coffee went cold a second time. The claim was airtight on the surface, filled with dates, bylaws, and county references. But the more I read, the more something felt off. There was no copy of any signed agreement binding my family to the HOA, no deed amendments, no proof of consent, just their word that my land fell under their jurisdiction. They even cited a plat map I'd never seen before, with lines drawn in suspiciously neat boxes. The boundaries didn't look right, slicing through open pasture like someone had been careless with a ruler. I knew I'd have to find my father's. Old files? The ranch's office was in the attic, a low-ceilinged space that smelled of cedar and dust. Boxes were stacked haphazardly, filled with everything from tax records to yellowed photographs. It took hours of digging before I found the heavy leather folder marked property. Inside were brittle deeds, surveys drawn in faded ink, and receipts for land taxes dating back to the 1940s. I carried it all downstairs and set it beside the HOA letter. The oldest survey showed our land long before the neighborhood existed. The property line wrapped around what was now half of Hillside Meadows like a horseshoe. There was no mention of any homeowners association because it hadn't been built yet. The next survey, dated 30 years later, looked different. The line had shifted inward, shaving off a huge section, as if the land had simply vanished. That change was my first real clue that something wasn't right. Property lines don't just move without paperwork, at least not legally. If the HOA's homes were sitting on what the old survey claimed was our land, that opened a dangerous door. It meant they might not just be wrong about me owing them money. It meant they might be the ones trespassing. I barely slept that night. Lying in bed with the ceiling fan turning slow circles overhead, every creak of the house made me think of lawyers, courtrooms, and endless legal bills. But under the fear was something else, a simmering anger. This ranch had been my family's legacy, and no HOA board was going to bully me off it. If they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. The next morning I drove into town to visit the county recorder's office. The building was a squat brick structure that smelled faintly of copier toner and old carpet. A clerk with wire-rimmed glasses guided me to a terminal where I could search historical records. I typed in the parcel number from the HOA letter, my hands tense on the keyboard. Within minutes, I had a trail of ownership records going back half a century. And that's when I saw it. The name on the earliest entries wasn't the HOA or any developer. It was my grandfather's. Even when the neighborhood was built, the legal descriptions still matched the old survey. Somewhere along the way, the records had been updated without any official transfer. It was as if the HOA had simply claimed the land and hoped no one would check. My pulse quickened as I printed the documents and slid them into a manila folder. I could feel the shape of the fight forming in my mind, sharp and deliberate. If I could prove this in court, the $250,000 debt wouldn't just vanish. The HOA might owe me far more than they could ever collect. I walked out of the recorder's office with the kind of determination that makes you stand taller. I drove straight to the ranch, the manila folder riding shotgun like a co-pilot in a silent mission. The sky was clearing, sunlight spilling over the pasture in long golden sheets. But even in the warmth of the morning, my chest felt tight with urgency. If the HOA was bold enough to send that letter, they wouldn't hesitate to escalate things. I needed a plan before they struck again. I set up shop in the kitchen with the folder, my laptop, and a pot of fresh coffee. The first step was understanding exactly how HOAs operated from a legal standpoint. I dove into articles, legal blogs, and even the association's own bylaws, which I found online. The deeper I read, the more their demands looked like a house built on sand. Half their claims depended on my land being inside their jurisdiction, which I was sure it all isn't by. By my mid-afternoon, I had pages of handwritten notes and a map covered in red pen. I circled every discrepancy between the surveys, marking the years where changes appeared. One date in particular stood out well. Years ago, just before my father's last hospital stay, that's when the boundary and county records quietly shifted inward. It reeked of opportunism, the kind of move made when no one is looking. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sunlight spill across the table. The smell of coffee and old paper filled the air, steadying me. For the first time since the letter arrived, I felt like I wasn't drowning. The HOA had made a mistake, maybe a criminal one, and I was in a position to expose it. But to do that, I'd need more than dusty surveys and my own conviction. That night, I called my cousin Ben, who'd gone into law after leaving the Army. He specialized in property disputes, though most of his cases were minor boundary arguments. When I told him what I'd found, there was a long pause on the line. Finally, he said, "If this is what it looks like, you might own more than you think." Those words sank into me like a seed taking root. Ben agreed to drive down the next day too, look at the evidence in person. We'd spent summers riding horses across this land, so he knew its history as well as I did. If anyone could help me make sense of the mess, it was him. In the meantime, he told me to keep every scrap of documentation locked away. "Don't give them the chance to make anything disappear," he warned. The following morning, Ben's truck rolled up the gravel drive just after sunrise. He stepped out with a leather briefcase in one hand and a thermos in the other. We shook hands, and I could see the flicker of excitement in his eyes. "This is big," he said before we'd even stepped inside. Bigger than an HOA shakedown, this could turn into a full-blown land reclamation case. We spread the papers across the dining table, arranging them in chronological order. Ben moved quickly, reading each deed, survey, and tax receipt with practiced precision. Every so often he'd whistle softly, the kind of sound lawyers make when they see opportunity. The old surveys, especially the earliest ones, were damning for the HOA. "They've been squatting on part of this property for years," he said flatly. It was strange hearing the word squatting applied to a manicured suburban street, but in legal terms, that's exactly what it was, an authorized use of someone else's land. Ben pulled out a legal pad and began outlining our next moves. First, we'd get an independent survey done to confirm the boundaries once and for all. Then we'd prepare a counterclaim that would make the HOA regret ever sending that letter. Called a local surveyor that afternoon, an older man named Jacob who'd worked in the county for decades. When we explained the situation, there was a pause, followed by a low chuckle. "I've been waiting years for someone to question those lines," he said, Apparently whispers about shady boundary changes had been floating around for a while. Jacob agreed to come out the following day with his equipment. That night, Ed and I sat on the porch with beers, watching the stars come out. The air was cool, carrying the scent of sage from the hills. I told him how helpless I'd felt when I first opened the HOA letter. He nodded slowly, then said, "They count on that feeling. That's how they win." I promised him they wouldn't. Win here not this time? The next morning, Jacob arrived in a battered pickup filled with tripods and measuring gear. He walked the property with a slow, deliberate pace, setting markers as he went. Ben and I followed, our boots crunching over dry grass, waiting for him to finish. By noon, he had a look on his face that told me everything. "You were right," he said. "They're deep into your land." Jacob's report was detailed, precise, and impossible to argue with. It showed the HOA neighborhood encroaching by several acres onto the ranch, not just a corner, lot, or two entire streets, were built on property that wasn't theirs. If the findings held up in court, the implications were staggering. The $250,000 demand now looked like the opening move. In a much bigger theft, Ben's legal mind was already in overdrive, mapping out the potential arguments. We'd not only challenge the debt, but seek compensation for years of unlawful use. There was even a possibility of claiming ownership of the structures built on my land. The thought was dizzying: houses, yards, sidewalks, all technically mine. But I knew we were still a long way from the finish line. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, the weight on my chest easing. The battle ahead would be ugly, but at least now I had a fighting chance. Somewhere out there, the HOA board members probably thought they'd scared me into submission. They had no idea I was already planning to turn the tables completely. And by the time they figured it out, it might be far too late. The next morning, Ben drafted a formal letter to the HOA, enclosing copies of Jacob's survey. It was polite, professional, and loaded with enough legal weight to sink a ship. The letter stated that their $250,000 claim was invalid and that they were, in fact, trespassing. It gave them 14 days to respond before we filed a counterclaim for damages. I signed it with a hand that didn't tremble. We sent it by certified mail, making sure there would be a paper trail. Then, all we could do was wait. The days passed slowly, filled with chores around the ranch and quiet anticipation. Every ring of the phone made my pulse quicken. Every car in the drive made me look twice. It was the kind of silence that comes before a storm. On the 7th day, an envelope arrived, thick and heavy. The return address matched the HOA's, but there was no gold foil this time. I opened it at the kitchen table with Ben watching from across the room. Inside was a 3-page letter from their attorney, dripping with condescension. They dismissed our claim as baseless and irrelevant to the debt owed. But beneath the bluster, I could see the cracks. The letter didn't deny the boundary issue outright, it skirted around. It claimed that historical use of the land gave them implied rights. That was legal smoke, a way of avoiding the actual facts. And if that was their best defense, we were in stronger shape than I'd hoped. Ben leaned back, reading the letter twice before letting out a low whistle. "They're nervous," he said. "That's why they didn't flat out reject the survey. They know it's legitimate." For the first time, I saw a hint of worry flicker in his eyes. Worry for them, not for me. They just realized this isn't going away. We spent the evening drafting our next move, this one more aggressive. Ben began compiling every scrap of evidence into a formal legal packet. We'd file it with the county court, forcing the HOA into a public fight. Once it was on record, they couldn't quietly backpedal or erase documents. Well, the case would take on a life of its own. The following week, the filing was complete and stamped by the clerk's office. It felt surreal walking out with a copy in my hands, a declaration of war. From here, the process would be slow, but we'd cross the point of no return. Somewhere in their tidy little meeting room, the HOA board was opening that packet and realizing, probably for the first time, that they had stepped into a trap. I imagined their faces as they flipped through the evidence-old deeds. Crisp surveys, legal citations, the quiet panic when they saw Jacob's seal, the county's stamp, my grandfather's name in black ink. They'd expected a simple debt collection, an easy victory over a lone rancher. Instead, they'd kicked a hornet's nest tied directly to their own foundations. And the hornets were now swarming. That night, I stood on the porch with the folder under my arm, looking out at the land. The moon lit the fields in pale silver, the fences casting long shadows. This fight wasn't just about money anymore. It was about history, justice, and respect. Every acre out there had been walked by my father, my grandfather, and now me. And I intended to make sure it stayed that way, no matter the cost. Somewhere out in the dark, the neat rows of hillside meadows sat quiet and unaware. Children slept in rooms built on land their parents didn't actually own. Porch lights glowed against the night, lining streets that weren't truly theirs. The HOA might still believe they could bluff their way through this. But soon enough, they'd understand this land was never theirs to take. The first shock came a week later, in the form of a bright orange notice nailed to my front gate. It was laminated, bold letters screaming code violation across the top. They accused me of unauthorized modifications to the fence, a claim that made no sense. That fence had stood for decades, long before the neighborhood even existed. It was a petty move, but it told me the HOA wasn't backing down. Read the notice, shaking his head with a bitter laugh. "They're trying to bury you in nuisance claims," he said. "It's a classic intimidation tactic. Stack up enough fines and hope you crack." I tore the paper down and tossed it on the kitchen table. If they wanted to play dirty, I could play smarter. The next morning, 2 more notices appeared, taped to my mailbox and stapled to a fence post. One accused me of improper weed control, the other of excessive dust from livestock activity. Apparently, my cattle were now a violation of neighborhood harmony. It was absurd, but the sudden flood of claims showed they were organized. Somewhere, a board meeting had turned into a war council. We documented every notice, photographing them before removing each one. Ben insisted on logging the time, date, and location of every incident. "Judges love timelines," he said. "If they're stupid enough to harass you during an active case, it's going to help us." I realized then that their aggression might become my best weapon. By the 3rd week, the harassment escalated. A process server arrived with a thick envelope containing a lawsuit from the HOA. They were demanding immediate payment of the $250,000 plus an additional $50,000 in penalties. The filing accused me of frivolous counterclaims and malicious interference with community operations. Ben read it twice before muttering, "They're panicking." Panic or not, it meant we were officially in a legal firefight. Filed our formal response within 48 hours, attaching Jacob's survey again. We also submitted copies of the old deeds and maps, each stamped and verified by the county. It was a wall of paper that no amount of bluster could knock down. Still, I knew the next few months would be brutal. Sure enough, the HOA began a smear campaign almost overnight. Flyers appeared on telephone poles in town, painting me as a litigious landowner threatening families. A local gossip blog ran a piece implying I planned to evict homeowners and bulldoze their houses. They wanted me to look like the villain before we ever stepped into a courtroom. It was petty, but it worked on some people. I started noticing cold stares at the feed store, hushed conversations when I walked into diners. Some neighbors stopped waving when I drove past. Others outright avoided me. Even people outside the HOA area seemed wary, as if I were some greedy land baron. Ben reminded me it was all part of the pressure. They want you to quit because they're afraid to fight you in court. One afternoon, a white SUV slowed in front of my property. A woman inside leaned out, shouting something I couldn't make out over the wind. When I walked closer, she yelled, "Hope you're proud of yourself, thief," before speeding off. I stood there in the dust, watching the taillights disappear down the road. The smear campaign was working better than I'd feared, but their tactics had a flaw. They were drawing attention to the case. Local reporters began sniffing around, curious about the dispute. One evening, a young journalist named Claire knocked on my door with a notebook in hand. She asked if I'd be willing to share my side of the story. Ben and I exchanged a glance, then invited her in. We laid out the evidence for her surveys, deeds, and the timeline of the HOA's actions. Claire listened carefully, scribbling notes while occasionally glancing at Jacob's report. "This is bigger than I expected," she said quietly. "If your evidence holds up, this could change property law in the county," she promised. To run the story, and for the first time, saw a chance to turn public opinion. 2 days later, the article appeared online and in the local paper. It was a balanced piece, but it clearly showed the strength of our evidence. Claire had even included a simplified map comparing the old boundaries to the HOA's version. It was clear who had taken from whom. The comments section lit up like a bonfire. Half the town seemed outraged at the HOA, demanding answers. The other half still saw me as the threat, but the tide was shifting. More importantly, the article caught the attention of a regional news station. A week later, a camera crew arrived at the ranch to film an interview. If the HOA wanted this to be public, I'd give them a spotlight they couldn't escape. Ben warned me to stick to facts during the interview, no matter how tempting it was to vent. We walked the crew around the property, showing the disputed boundaries. They filmed Jacob pointing out survey markers and explaining how the HOA lines were wrong. It was dry stuff, but it looked authoritative on camera. The piece aired that weekend, and suddenly our fight was front-page news. The HOA's response came fast and loud. Their attorney held a press conference, calling my claims fabricated and unsupported by law. They doubled down on the $250,000 demand, saying failure to pay would jeopardize the stability of the community. It was theater, pure and simple, meant to rally their members. But it also meant they were now defending themselves in the court of public opinion. Meanwhile, our legal preparation was in overdrive. Ben began working with a litigation firm that specialized in land disputes. We gathered sworn affidavits from old ranch hands, neighbors, and even a retired county surveyor. Each one confirmed the ranch's historic boundaries matched our claim. The pile of evidence grew taller with each passing week. By midsummer, the court date was set for early fall. The heat baked the land, and tempers in town seemed just as hot. I avoided unnecessary trips into the neighborhood, not wanting to provoke anyone. But every now and then, I'd drive past slowly, just to remind myself what was at stake. Entire streets, rows of homes, playgrounds all technically sitting on my deed. Then came the incident with the truck. One evening, as I was closing the barn, headlights appeared at the far end of the drive. Da-da-da-da. A pickup roared toward the gate, stopping just short before peeling away in a spray of gravel. No one got out. No words were exchanged. But the message was clear. The fight had moved beyond paper and into intimidation. Ben insisted we install cameras along the property line. I agreed. We also notified the sheriff, who promised to increase patrols in the area. The deputies were polite, but I could tell. They didn't want to get between me and the HOA. It was a small town, and everyone knew someone on the other side. Still, the cameras gave me some peace of mind. Despite the tension, we kept pushing forward. Ben filed motions to compel the HOA to produce their own original surveys. When they finally did, the documents were a mess, missing signatures, incorrect dates, and odd alterations. One even had white out over a portion of the boundary line. It was the kind of thing that made judges raise their eyebrows. The pretrial hearings were tense affairs. Their lawyer was slick, confident, and clearly used to bulldozing smaller opponents. But Ben met him point for point, never letting a claim go unanswered. Every time Jacob's survey was mentioned, the HOA attorney tried to change the subject. It was becoming obvious they feared the moment a judge saw the evidence in full. One afternoon, after a particularly heated hearing, I caught sight of the HOA president in the hallway. She was a neatly dressed woman in her 50s, hair pinned back, expression tight. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I saw something flicker. They're not anger, but doubt. It was gone in an instant as she turned and walked away. But it told. MeWe were getting under their skin. As summer waned, the weight of the fight began to press harder. The legal bills were piling up, even with Ben cutting his rates for family. I was still running the ranch, but every free moment was swallowed by the case. Sometimes I'd wake in the night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if it was worth it. But then I'd think of my grandfather, and the answer was always yes. The week before trial, Claire called with a tip. She'd overheard a board member at a cafe talking about settlement discussions. It was unconfirmed, but it suggested cracks were forming behind the scenes. If they were thinking about settling, it meant they saw the risk. Ben told me not to get my hopes up, but I could tell he was encouraged. 2 days later, we received an email from the HOA's attorney. It was brief, just a request to discuss potential resolution options prior to trial. Ben smirked as he read it aloud. "They're fishing to see how desperate we are," he said. "But this means they're scared, and scared opponents make mistakes." We agreed to meet them in a neutral conference room at the courthouse. The air was thick with unspoken hostility as we sat across the table. Their attorney opened with a proposal, dropped the counterclaim, and they dropped the $250,000 demand. It was laughable, a desperate attempt to cut their losses. I told them the only deal I'd accept was full acknowledgement of the land boundaries and compensation. The meeting ended without agreement, but their shaken expressions were worth it. We walked out knowing we'd held the high ground. The next time we'd see each other, it would be in front of a judge. The stakes were enormous, the evidence was ready, and neither side could back down now. For the first time, I felt certain we were going to win. The morning of the trial, the courthouse steps felt like the edge of a battlefield. The sun was just climbing over the rooftops, spilling gold across the square. Porters were already there, cameras trained on the doors, like vultures waiting for movement. Ben walked beside me, his briefcase swinging with steady rhythm. "This is it," he said. "No more letters, no more waiting, just facts." Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of polish and old paper. Rows of wooden benches faced the judges. Bench, the state flag hanging in quiet authority. The HOA's legal team sat across from us, sleek in their tailored suits. The president of the board avoided my eyes, her posture rigid. Ben began laying out our files like a general arranging maps before a campaign. When the judge entered, the room rose as one, the shuffle of feet echoing. He was an older man with a calm expression that gave away nothing. After the formalities, he invited the HOA's attorney to give opening statements first. The lawyer stood, voice smooth, painting me as a reckless opportunist. To hear him tell I was a man chasing a payday, not defending my family's land. I kept my face still, resisting the urge to react. Their attorney spoke for nearly 20 minutes, sprinkling in legal jargon and moral appeals. He framed the HOA as protectors of community harmony, fighting off a land grab. It was clever designed to play on emotions rather than facts. Ben had warned me this was coming, and our turn was next. When Ben rose, his voice was steady, measured, and sharp. He began not with accusations, but with history. He spoke of the ranch's founding, the generations who'd worked, the soil, the old boundaries. Then he laid down the surveys, each one dated, stamped, and indisputable. The judge's eyes lingered on Jacob's report longer than I expected. Our first witness was Jacob himself, called to the stand to authenticate his work. He explained the survey process in clear, confident terms. With a pointer, he traced the boundary lines on a large map mounted on an easel. The contrast between the original boundaries and the HOA's claimed lines was startling. Several jurors leaned forward, squinting as if seeing it for the first time. The HOA's cross-examination of Jacob was almost comical. They tried to imply his equipment might be outdated or that his methods were flawed. Jacob, unflappable, explained that modern GPS surveying leaves almost no margin of error. He even offered to demonstrate with the court's own property maps. By the end, their lawyer looked frustrated, flipping papers without finding an opening. Next, Ben called a retired county surveyor named Howard. Howard had overseen property records for 30 years before retiring. He testified that the boundary changes in the HOA's documents were irregular and unrecorded. He'd never seen a legitimate transfer of that section of land to the HOA. His words landed like hammer blows in the silent courtroom. The HOA's defense strategy became clearer with each witness. They weren't going to argue the history, they were going to argue implied rights. Their claim was that decades of using the land had given them permanent access. Ben countered with case law showing how such claims fail without formal agreements. Still, I could see them hoping the concept would confuse the jury. Midway through the first day, Claire appeared in the gallery, pen in hand. She gave me a quick nod, as if to say, "I'm watching." Her presence reminded me that whatever happened here would ripple beyond the room. Every answer, every exhibit, would shape the public story. I straightened my posture and kept my focus on the judge. Our final witness of the day was Ben's ace, an archivist from the State Land Office. She brought with her microfilm records of the oldest deeds on file. The documents confirmed, beyond doubt, that my grandfather's title had never been altered. They also showed how the HOA's earliest plats had been drawn over our land. Gasps rippled through the benches as the copies were projected on the wall. When court adjourned for the day, stepped outside into a wall of microphones. Questions flew from every direction, some hostile, some curious. I kept my answers short and calm, letting the evidence speak for itself. Ben slipped a hand to my shoulder, guiding me toward the car. "You did good," he said. "Now get some rest, we're not done." The second day began with the HOA calling their own witnesses. First up was their current board president, Immaculate, in a Navy suit. She spoke of community values, the need for uniformity, the importance of rules. Under Ben's cross-examination, she admitted she'd never personally reviewed the original deeds. That single admission hung in the air like a stone dropping into still water. Their next witness was a developer involved in the neighborhood's construction. He claimed the land had been purchased in good faith decades ago. But when Ben asked for proof of sale, the man hesitated. He finally admitted the deal had been verbal, with no written transfer. That answer drew an audible murmur from the gallery. By midday, the HOA's case was showing cracks. Their attorney tried to pivot, painting me as someone exploiting technicalities. Ben countered by reminding the court that property law exists for a reason. "If we ignore boundaries," he said, "we ignore the very concept of ownership." The judge nodded slightly, though his face remained unreadable. In the afternoon, the HOA called a property appraiser to suggest my claims were exaggerated. He argued that even if boundaries shifted, the value impact was minimal. Ben dismantled the argument by pointing out that ownership isn't about price, it's about rights. He also revealed the appraiser had been paid by the HOA just days before testifying. The jury's expressions hardened at that disclosure. When the second day closed, the momentum had shifted. Even the reporters outside seemed to sense it there. Questions sharper toward the HOA. Claire caught me on the step saying, "Tomorrow's the real turning point." I knew she was right. The next witnesses would either cement our case or unravel it. That night I slept in short bursts, my mind replaying every word from the stand. Day 3 began with Ben recalling Jacob for a brief rebuttal. He used the time to address minor points the HOA had tried to twist. Jacob clarified each one with the precision of a surgeon, leaving no gaps. By the time he stepped down, the HOA's earlier attacks on his credibility looked foolish. It was a small victory, but it mattered. Then came the moment I dreaded my own testimony. I took the stand, swore the oath, and settled into the chair. Ben led me through my family's history on the ranch, the inheritance, the letter. I spoke slowly, making sure each fact was clear and exact. The courtroom felt smaller with every pair of eyes on me. When the HOA's attorney began cross-examining me, his tone was sharp. He tried to provoke me, implying greed and malicious intent. I kept my voice even, answering each question without flinching. Inside, my pulse was hammering, but I didn't let it show. By the end, his questions were looping back on themselves. The judge called for a recess, and I stepped outside into the sunlight. Ben joined me, offering a half smile. "You didn't give him an inch," he said. "That's all we needed from you." I took a deep breath, feeling the tension ease slightly. When court resumed, Ben announced we were resting our case. The HOA's attorney did the same, signaling the close of testimony. The judge instructed both sides to prepare for closing arguments the next morning. As we packed our files, I caught the board president glancing my way. Her expression was tight, almost brittle, as if she knew what was coming. Outside, reporters swarmed again, their questions louder now. I answered a few, careful not to speculate about the verdict. Ben was already thinking 3 moves ahead, talking about possible appeals. But I could tell from his tone he didn't expect we'd need 1. For the first time, the end of the fight felt close enough to touch.